Доброго дня.
Good morning, dear speaker, guests, and all the viewers. Ukrainian Crisis Media Center is starting its working day, and I announce the beginning of the launch of the report of OHCHR, presenting the new report on Ukraine. I would like to give the floor to Matilda Bogner, the head of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine.
And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, I would like to welcome those persons here today and those joining us online. Today, we are launching our 34th periodic report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, which covers the period from the 1st of February to the 31st of July 2022. Our findings are based on information gathered during 78 field visits, 20 visits to places of detention, and 1,024 interviews with victims, witnesses of human rights violations, their relatives and lawyers, government representatives, as well as other sources of information. Before elaborating on our findings, I wish to mention that since the publication of our last report at the end of June, OHCHR has increased its presence in the country. We currently have staff deployed in 6 locations throughout the country. Every day, we speak to people and hear from victims who have suffered human rights violations in the context of the armed conflict, which escalated following the armed attack of the Russian Federation. Civilians continue to bear the brunt of the hostilities. As of this week, we have documented 5,996 people that have been killed and 8,848 injured. Those killed included 382 children. These figures represent verified individual incidents, and the actual figures are considerably higher. Intense hostilities have also destroyed housing and other civilian infrastructure. Attacks impacting civilian objects not only endanger the lives of civilians, but also left them living in degrading conditions and undermining their rights to health, education, housing, food, and water. Intense shelling also negatively impacted freedom of religion or belief, with many buildings of worship destroyed and damaged. To date, we have recorded damage or destruction to 252 medical facilities and 415 educational facilities across the country, while the actual numbers are higher. The vast majority of civilian casualties that we have documented since the 24th of February were caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, for the most part by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. Shelling from heavy artillery, such as multiple launch rocket systems and missile and air attacks, include weapons that carry cluster munitions, were used repeatedly. While OHCHR has not been able to assess compliance with international humanitarian law for each individual incident, the scale of damage and destruction strongly indicates that violations of international humanitarian law have occurred. The heavy toll that these weapons have had on civilians is evident from a number of high-profile incidents. On the 30th of May, for example, shelling of residential areas in Donetsk killed 6 civilians, including 1 girl, and injuring 10, including 2 children. On the 21st of June, an MLRS strike killed 1 girl and 1 man and injured 5 other civilians in the city of Makiivka, controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. On the 27th of June, a missile strike hit a shopping mall in Kremenchuk in Poltava region in government-controlled territory, killing 21 civilians and injuring 61, including 1 child. On the 1st of July, a missile hit an apartment building and recreation center in Sergievska, Odessa region in government-controlled territory, killing 21 civilians, including 1 boy, injuring 39, including 3 boys and 3 girls. The armed conflict has led to a wide range of violations of the rights to life, liberty, and security of persons for both civilians and combatants. We are gravely concerned by the unlawful killings, including summary executions of civilians by Russian armed forces in more than 30 settlements in Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions. Following several field visits to settlements in Kiev and Chernihiv regions, we've corroborated willful killings of civilians by Russian armed forces. In some cases, they shot civilians while fleeing in their vehicles, crossing the road on foot, or gathering basic foodstuffs, sometimes by snipers. In other cases, the killings amounted to summary executions. For example, we documented the case of three civilian men who were tortured and then killed in Stoyanka, Kiev region, a village controlled by Russian armed forces, in March this year. A witness saw two of the men escorted by Russian soldiers walking towards a house. The bodies of the men and that of a third man from the village were subsequently found in the basement of the house with signs of torture. Their hands and legs were bound, and they had multiple knife wounds and severed fingers. Over the 6-month reporting period, we documented 407 cases, which included 359 men, 47 women, and 1 boy, of enforced disappearances and the arbitrary detention of civilians in territory controlled by Russian armed forces or affiliated armed groups. 18 of the victims, 1 woman and 17 men, were eventually found dead. Most of the victims were active or former public officials of local authorities, human rights defenders, civil society activists, journalists, and media workers. Many relatives of these civilians have no information about the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones detained during the first months of the armed attack. We also documented 31 cases of enforced disappearance by Ukrainian law enforcement bodies of people suspected of supporting Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. These enforced disappearances have usually lasted for several days, and detentions were later formalized, although in 2 cases the victims remained disappeared. We received appalling reports of torture and ill treatment by Russian armed forces. Out of the 38 released civilians, which includes 34 men and 4 women, we interviewed, 33 reported having various forms of torture and ill treatment inflicted on them while in custody in order to force them to confess to having cooperated with the Ukrainian armed forces, or to force them to cooperate with Russian armed forces or affiliated armed groups, or simply to intimidate them. We documented, for example, the case of 2 men who were tortured to death in Kherson by Russian armed forces. Both men were reportedly members of the Territorial Defense Force, but had laid down their arms and did not participate directly in hostilities after Russian armed forces entered the city. On the 27th of March, they were detained by Russian armed forces in the local police department, where they were accused of assisting Ukrainian armed forces. They were severely beaten and left without medical assistance. In mid-April, one of the victims was brought to Sevastopol and died of his injuries soon after. The body of the other man was found in the Dnipro River in late May. We also recorded 34 complaints of torture or ill treatment in cases of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, reportedly perpetrated by law enforcement bodies of Ukraine. The complaints included beatings, threats of executions, threats of shooting the victims in the arms or legs, and threats of bringing detainees to the front line and abandoning them there. I stress that the prohibition of torture and arbitrary deprivation of life is absolute and applies in conflict and non-conflict settings to all persons, regardless of whether they are civilians or combatants. Perpetrators must be held to account, and victims and their relatives must enjoy their rights to remedy and truth. We continue to document cases of conflict-related sexual violence. Due to the precarious security situation in parts of Ukraine, mass displacement, stigma and trauma associated with sexual violence, and lack of victims' access to services, the extent of violations are not yet fully clear. During the reporting period, we documented 9 cases of rape against 8 women and 1 girl, 15 cases of sexual violence used as a method of torture or ill treatment against men, and 11 cases of forced public stripping against both men and women considered to be lawbreakers. 30 cases were committed by Russian security forces, 2 cases were committed by Ukrainian security forces, and 11 cases were committed by civilians or members of territorial defence units. We continue looking into all allegations that we receive. Since our reporting period ended, we have verified a further 13 cases of sexual violence. In one case, for example, 2 Russian soldiers came to the house of a couple and their 4-year-old daughter. At gunpoint, they took the woman to a room, ordered her to her knees, and gang raped her. Her husband was brought from another room and forced to watch. They then beat him with a pot and forced him to perform sexual acts on her while they watched. We are following closely the situation of prisoners of war. During the reporting period, our human rights officers had unimpeded access to places of internment of prisoners of war in territory controlled by the government of Ukraine. On the other hand, we were not granted confidential access to places of internment for Ukrainian prisoners of war in territory controlled by Russian armed forces or affiliated armed groups. Information that we receive indicates that Ukrainian prisoners of war face serious risks to their health and safety. They have been subjected to cruel and degrading treatment by Russian security forces or those of the affiliated armed groups, which appeared to be systematic, not only upon their capture, but also following their transfer to places of internment, both in territory of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation and in the Russian Federation itself. We documented 2 deaths of Ukrainian servicemen as a result of torture. The first was beaten and electrocuted to death by members of Russian armed forces on the 9th of May at the Melitopol airfield. Witnesses told us that the victim was brought to the classroom of a pilot school, showing signs of torture, and died soon after. The second victim sustained lethal blows when guards beat prisoners of war upon their arrival to the Volnovacha penal colony near Alenivka, Donetsk region, on the 17th of April. We also documented cases of torture and ill treatment of prisoners of war by the members of the Ukrainian armed forces during their capture or while in transit camps of internment. These include cases where prisoners of war were beaten, shot, stabbed in the legs, electrocuted, forced to remain in one position for prolonged periods, and threatened with physical violence by members of the Ukrainian armed forces after they had surrendered. During the reporting period, we received allegations of human rights violations committed during the so-called filtration of civilians by Russian armed forces or affiliated armed groups. During filtration processes, Russian armed forces or affiliated armed groups often subjected persons to body searches, sometimes involving forced nudity and detailed interrogations about family ties, political views, and allegiances. We received numerous allegations that men and women who were perceived as having ties with Ukrainian armed forces or state institutions or having pro-Ukrainian or anti-Russian views were subjected to arbitrary detention, torture, ill treatment, and enforced disappearance. Since the 24th of February, nearly 7 million persons have been displaced within Ukraine. The government of Ukraine has contributed to evacuation efforts and launched, for example, a program to provide basic accommodation, healthcare, and financial assistance to those forced to flee affected areas of the hostilities. We hope that with the winter approaching, all categories of internally displaced persons will have access to the benefits of the program, including those without access to smartphones or digital access and those without identification documents. Women, men and children with disabilities residing in both communities and long-term care facilities have been at particular risk since the start of the armed attack by the Russian Federation. They have lacked access to bomb shelters, evacuation trains, necessary medical and adequate housing suited to their needs. In areas affected by hostilities, older women without families have been particularly vulnerable to economic hardship due to the low pensions many of them receive as a result of discrimination in the labour market or caregiving responsibilities in the past. They often lack financial resources to repair their homes and maintain an adequate standard of living. With winter fast approaching, this puts them at particular risk. I welcome the efforts of the government of Ukraine to investigate and prosecute violations of international humanitarian law and violations of international human rights law perpetrated in the context of the armed attack by the Russian Federation, and to bring perpetrators to account. It is crucial that the international community continues to support increased capacity for Ukraine's investigations into alleged war crimes. The collection and preservation of evidence, including forensic evidence, will be key to ensuring accountability. We are concerned, however, at certain fair trial violations documented in proceedings against servicemen of the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. In 19 documented cases, defendants did not have the possibility to speak with their appointed legal aid lawyer prior to the trial. We also observed that at least 13 trials were conducted in what appears to be expedited proceedings. In those cases, verdicts were based mostly on admissions of guilt, and concerns were raised regarding coerced confessions. We note the government has launched investigations into incidents of inhumane treatment of prisoners of war by Ukrainian security forces, as well as cases of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, and we are waiting to see prosecutions against those responsible. The Russian Federation is also obliged to investigate, prosecute and punish members of its armed forces and of Russian-affiliated armed groups found to have committed violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including summary executions, sexual violence, torture and other cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment against civilians and prisoners of war. We are not aware of any measures taken at the national level in the Russian Federation to hold its combatants or those in command to account for such violations. We are concerned that any efforts to date have been focused only on the prosecution of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians in proceedings that lack transparency, independence and impartiality. Freedom of expression has also drastically deteriorated. We documented 17 cases of deaths of journalists, media workers and bloggers from hostilities, and to date have recorded 17 cases of injured journalists. We are particularly alarmed that 4 journalists were injured by gunfire while wearing protective gear in cars that were clearly marked as press or TV. We are concerned about restricted access to Ukrainian media in territory under control of Russian armed forces or affiliated armed groups who disconnected Ukrainian television channels and radio stations, replacing them with channels from the Russian Federation or self-proclaimed republics. The Human Rights Committee has stated that restrictions to the right to freedom of expression are permitted only if they are necessary and proportionate for the protection of national security. In Crimea, in the aftermath of the armed attack against Ukraine, Russian Federation authorities applied legislation to penalize a wide spectrum of criticism of the Russian authorities and its armed forces. The application of these laws in Crimea unduly restricted the right to freedom of opinion and expression and severely limited the space for dissenting views on matters of public interest. We recorded 29 cases where individuals were sanctioned for social media posts in which they had criticized the armed attack by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, blamed Russian political leaders or armed forces for alleged war crimes, or called for the end to hostilities with slogans akin to "Stop the War." Teachers in Crimea also came under pressure to endorse Russia's so-called special military operation and to generally refrain from criticizing the Russian authorities. The information, regulatory and security environment in which human rights defenders operated in Crimea has also significantly deteriorated. The legitimate activities of human rights defenders were obstructed by arrests and prosecutions, as well as the blocking of access to websites of human rights NGOs. During the reporting period, we documented 5 attacks against 8 lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex persons, also known by the acronym LGBTI, people in government-controlled territory, in territory occupied by the Russian Federation or controlled by affiliated armed groups and Russian armed forces. The overall environment for the LGBTI community remains dangerous and highly restrictive. The Russian Federation's armed attack has caused the death of thousands of innocent people and widespread destruction throughout the country. For as long as this armed conflict continues, all parties are bound to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. In particular, the parties must commit to protecting every civilian woman, man and child, and those hors de combat. They must observe the fundamental rules of international humanitarian law, namely the rules of distinction, proportionality and precaution. In our report, we urge the parties to the conflict to ensure timely and effective investigations into all allegations of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including torture, ill treatment, arbitrary detention and sexual violence, and ensure that alleged perpetrators are duly prosecuted, including persons in positions of command. We also call on the parties to facilitate provision of information on a regular basis to relatives of prisoners of war regarding their loved ones, in particular about their places of internment and health status, and ensure that prisoners of war are able to correspond with the outside world. We urge the parties to cease practices of exposing prisoners of war to public curiosity through recording and publishing videos of them. We will continue to document and report the facts on the ground and the voices of victims. We consider this to be an essential part of seeking to prevent further violations and to hold those accountable for the violations already committed. Thank you for listening today.
Thank you very much for the report. We don't have any questions in online. We have questions here in the hall? We don't have any questions, so thank you very much for your report.